The morning Lillian Thatcher rode up to the Hale ranch with a borrowed rifle resting across her saddle. She had no intention of staying more than 10 minutes, and she certainly had no intention of falling in love. The year was 1878, and the territory of Wyoming had a way of beating sentiment out of people before winter even arrived. Lillian knew that truth better than most. She had buried her husband, Robert Thatcher, 7 months prior, laid him in the hard ground just east of their modest homestead with nothing but a preacher's words and a handful of neighbors to see him off. The fever had taken him fast, the way fevers did out on the open plain, where the nearest doctor was a day's ride and hope was sometimes the only medicine available. She was 31 years old. She had a small farm with 30 acres of dry grassland, 2 milk cows, a mule named Chester, and a rifle that did not belong to her. The rifle was the problem. Robert had borrowed it from Gilbert Hale the spring before he died. Gilbert ran the largest cattle operation in Sweetwater County, a sprawling outfit called the Double H Ranch that sat at the foot of a long ridge of red rock maybe 8 miles northeast of Lillian's property. Robert had gone to borrow it because a mountain lion had been circling their land and killing chickens, and his own Winchester had cracked its stock against a fence post. He had promised to return it in 2 weeks. He never got the chance. Lillian had kept it oiled and clean those 7 months, the way Robert would have wanted. She had kept it propped against the kitchen wall beside the door, telling herself she would return it when the roads dried up after the spring mud, then when the summer heat broke, then when she had a spare afternoon. The truth was that every time she looked at the rifle, she thought of Robert borrowing it with his easy smile and his calloused hands, and it hurt to think about returning it because returning it felt like admitting, in some small and final way, that all of that was done. But October had come. The sky was pressing low and gray over the plains, and her neighbor Dorothea Finch had warned her the high passes would close with snow inside a month. If she waited much longer, she would not be able to make the ride at all until spring. And it was not right, holding another man's property through another whole season. So she had wrapped herself in her good wool coat, the dark brown one with the brass buttons Robert had ordered for her from a catalog, and she had bridled her mare, a pale gray named Pearl, and she had set the rifle across the saddle in front of her and started northeast. The Double H Ranch appeared out of the low sage, and the autumn brown grass the way big things often did in Wyoming, all at once and larger than expected. There was a long main house built from Douglas fir logs, 2 stories tall with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Behind it sat a massive barn painted red, though the paint had faded and weathered to the color of dried blood. There were 2 bunkhouses, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, a root cellar with a heavy timber door, and a network of corrals and fence lines that stretched out toward the ridge until they disappeared in the sage. A windmill stood tall against the gray sky, its blades turning slow in the October air, creaking with a sound that carried across the yard. 3 cowboys were working near the near corral, restringing a section of fence that had come down. They looked up when Lillian rode in through the main gate, a simple post-andrail affair with the Double H brand burned into a plank above it. One of them tipped his hat. She nodded back and kept going toward the house. She was stepping down from Pearl when the front door of the main house opened, and Gilbert Hale walked out onto the porch. She had seen him before, of course. This was a small enough county that you saw everyone eventually, at the general store in Rawlins, at church on the Sundays when the weather permitted, at the 4th of July celebration the previous summer. But she had never spoken to him at any length. He had spoken mostly with Robert at those occasions, the way men did, talking cattle prices and water rights and the railroad survey that everyone said was coming through the valley. What she noticed now, seeing him step off his own porch in his own yard with the October light flat and pale behind him, was that he was a quiet-looking man. Not small, not by any measure. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent every day of his adult life doing hard physical work, with dark hair that was going gray at the temples and along the sides. He wore it a little long for a rancher, she thought, curling slightly over his collar. His face was weathered, deeply lined at the corners of his eyes and his mouth, with a strong jaw and a nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked. He was 40 years old, she would learn later. He looked like the land he lived on. He looked like he had earned every line. He walked down the porch steps and came across the yard toward her, and his expression was not unwelcoming, but it was careful. The kind of careful that belonged to a man who had learned to read situations before he spoke. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I didn't expect company today." "I don't mean to be an imposition," she said. She reached back and lifted the rifle from the saddle scabbard and held it out toward him. "This belongs to you. Robert borrowed it from you last April. I am sorry it has taken so long to get it back." He looked at the rifle for a moment, then at her. Something moved across his face, some brief and genuine thing that she could not quite name. "I remember," he said. He reached out and took the rifle, turning it over once in his hands the way you did with a thing you had not seen in a while. "I heard about Mr. Thatcher. I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. I should have come by to say so sooner." "Everyone has their own work to see to," Lillian said, which was what she always said because it was easy, and it let people off the hook, and she did not like to see people uncomfortable on her account. Gilbert Hale looked at her for a moment too long, just a half-second more than was polite, and she had the disconcerting feeling that he had heard exactly what she was doing and was not fooled by it. Then he looked at her horse and at the sky and back at her. "You rode 8 miles in October with weather coming," he said. "It was not a question exactly." "I did not want to wait until spring," she said. He nodded slowly. "Well, you are out here now and the wind is picking up. Would you come inside for coffee, Mrs. Thatcher? It would not be right to send you back without something warm in you first." She should have said no. She had her list of chores waiting back at the homestead, and she was not in the habit of sitting in men's houses drinking coffee. But the wind had in fact begun to cut sharper just in the last few minutes, and the ride back was 8 miles of open plain with no shelter, and she was cold. "A cup of coffee would be very kind," she said. "Thank you." He led Pearl to the hitching rail at the side of the house himself, which was not what she expected. She had thought he might call one of his cowboys to do it, the way large ranch owners sometimes did, as if the distance between themselves and physical labor was something to be demonstrated. But he wrapped the reins himself with practiced efficiency, and then held the front door for her and followed her inside. The interior of the main house was nothing like she had imagined. She had imagined something rough and purely functional, the way a bachelor's establishment was likely to be, with unwashed dishes and saddle gear left on the furniture, and the general air of a place that had given up on comfort. What she found was a room that was clean and warm and genuinely lived in. There was a large stone fireplace on the north wall with a fire going, and above it a mantel with a few objects arranged on it, a small clock, a ceramic vase with dried wildflowers in it, a folded piece of paper that looked like a letter. The furniture was plain but solid, a round table with 4 chairs, 2 armchairs near the fire, a long bookshelf along the east wall that held 24 books and a collection of maps. There was a braided rug on the plank floor, the colors muted but still warm, and the windows were hung with plain white cotton curtains. It was a house that someone had thought about. She noticed that immediately. He set the rifle on the rack beside the door, next to a second rifle and a short-barreled shotgun, and he gestured toward the armchairs by the fire. "Sit and warm yourself," he said. "I will get the coffee. My cook, Martinez, has it on all morning, so you are lucky in that regard." She sat in the nearer armchair and held her hands toward the fire, letting the warmth work into her fingers. She heard him moving in the back of the house in the kitchen. She looked at the bookshelf. She could read some of the spines from where she sat. There was a Bible, well worn, a copy of Moby Dick, several cattle management volumes, a book of maps of the Wyoming territory. a thin volume that she could not read the title of, and one that surprised her entirely, a collection of Emily Dickinson's poetry, the spine cracked from use. She was still looking at it when he came back with 2 heavy ceramic mugs of coffee and a small tin plate with 3 pieces of Johnny cake on it. "You have poetry on your shelf," she said, which was not at all what she had intended to say. He glanced at the bookshelf as he handed her the mug and set the plate on the small table between the chairs. He sat in the other armchair without any self-consciousness about the observation. "My mother sent it," he said. "She thought it would improve my character. Did it?" He considered this with what she was beginning to understand was his characteristic deliberateness. "I'm not sure I can measure the improvement reliably," he said, "but I read it." She smiled before she could help herself. It was the first time she had smiled at anything in what felt like months, and it surprised her, the feeling of it. Like a muscle she had forgotten she had. She looked away quickly and took a sip of the coffee, which was strong and black and very good. "How are you managing?" he asked. "On the homestead." "Fine," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. 30 acres is a lot of ground for one person," he said, not unkindly, just as a fact. "I have Chester," she said. "My mule." "Chester," he repeated, and she thought she detected the very faint ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "He is an extremely capable mule," she said. "Do not let the name mislead you." He looked at her then, and he did smile, a real one, and she saw that it changed his whole face. It took those deep lines around his eyes and mouth and made them into something warm rather than something weathered. It made him look, briefly, like a younger man. "I do not doubt it," he said. They drank their coffee and ate the Johnny cake, and she found that the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had grown so accustomed to the silence of the homestead, which was the silence of a place where there used to be another person and no longer was, that she had almost forgotten that silence between 2 people could be an easy thing. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee, which she had not planned on, when one of his cowboys knocked on the door to report that the new section of fence was up, but that 3 of the far pasture steers had pushed through a gap in the east fence line and gotten out onto the ridge. Gilbert excused himself immediately, and she followed him to the door, because she had stayed longer than she intended and it was time to go. She was pulling on her coat when the cowboy, a young man of maybe 20 with a red bandana around his neck, said, "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hale. Did not know you had company." "No trouble," Gilbert said, shrugging on his own coat. She stepped out onto the porch. The wind had gotten significantly stronger in the last hour, and the sky to the northwest had gone a particular shade of yellow-gray that she recognized from 7 years of Wyoming winters. That color meant weather, and it meant it was coming faster than expected. Gilbert stepped out beside her and looked at the sky and then at the northwest horizon, and his expression did something quiet and serious. "That is coming in fast," he said. "I can see that," she said, already calculating. 8 miles. If she left right now and rode hard, she could probably beat the worst of it, probably. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, "I would feel considerably better if you did not try to ride that 8 miles in what is about to come down." "I have ridden in bad weather before," she said. "I know you have," he said, "but there is bad weather and then there is whatever that is." He nodded at the northwest sky. "That is the kind of thing that gets people turned around out on the plain, and they do not find their way home again. I have lost 2 head of cattle in storms that looked less threatening than this one." She looked at the sky. She looked at Pearl standing patient at the hitching rail. She thought about Chester at home in his little shed and her milk cows, and the fact that she had left them with water and feed this morning specifically because she had not known how long the ride might take. "I have animals that need tending," she said. "I can send one of my men to look in on them," he said. "Calloway," he gestured at the young cowboy with the red bandana. "He knows animal husbandry. He will make sure everything is settled." Calloway nodded earnestly. "Yes, ma'am, no trouble at all." She stood on the porch looking at the sky for a long moment. The wind was pulling strands of her dark hair loose from the pins she had put it up with that morning, dragging them across her face. She pushed them back. "I do not want to put anyone out," she said. "You would be doing me the favor," Gilbert said. I would spend the whole storm worried about you trying to navigate that open ground." She looked at him. There was no flattery in it, no manipulation. He said it the way a man says a true thing, plainly and without ornament. "All right," she said. "Thank you. I will accept your hospitality for the night." The storm arrived within the hour, and it was every bit as bad as the sky had promised. The wind drove snow horizontally across the yard, with a force that made the windows rattle in their frames. By late afternoon, visibility was down to perhaps 10 feet, and the snow had built up against the north-facing walls of the outbuildings in drifts that were already knee-high and growing. Calloway came back in from the Thatcher homestead just as the storm was truly hitting, stomping snow off his boots in the doorway, and reported that the 2 milk cows were in the linta with fresh water and hay. The mule Chester was settled, and, he added with a grin, appeared to be a very fine animal indeed, and everything was as squared away as a man could make it. Lillian thanked him sincerely, and he went off to the bunkhouse looking pleased with himself. The cook, Martinez, a compact and cheerful Mexican man in his 50s, who wore an apron over his work clothes and moved around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who owned the place, produced a supper that evening that was far better than anything Lillian had eaten in a long time. There was venison stew with onions and dried chilies and biscuits that were light and slightly sweet, and a pot of beans cooked with salt pork, and for dessert, a dried apple pie that tasted like something a person might dream about. She ate at the round table in the main room, and Gilbert Hale sat across from her, and Martinez set the food between them and then tactfully disappeared back into the kitchen. Outside, the storm howled and pushed against the walls of the house, and inside the fire burned and the lamp on the table made everything warm and yellow, and Lillian Thatcher sat across from a man she barely knew and ate the best supper she had eaten in 7 months. "You have a good operation here," she said, when they had been eating long enough that silence had become comfortable again. "It took a long time to build," he said. He was cutting his biscuit in half, methodical. "I started with 11 head and $100 and a piece of ground that everyone in the county thought was too rocky to be worth anything. And everyone was wrong. The grass under the ridge is good," he said. "Stays green later than the lower ground. I got lucky." "I do not think it was entirely luck," she said. He glanced up at her. There was something in that glance that she felt in a way she had not felt anything in a long time, a kind of warm attention, as if she were something worth looking at carefully. "My wife used to say the same thing," he said, "that I was too quick to call things luck." She registered the past tense immediately. "You were married," she said. "For 6 years," he said. He looked back at his plate. "Margaret, she died 4 years ago, childbirth." The words were simple and the delivery was calm, the calm of someone who has said a true and painful thing so many times that the sharp edges have been worn smooth by repetition. But she heard the weight behind them. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in the complete way, not the polite way. She was from Ohio, he said. She thought Wyoming was the end of the world when we first came out here. She grew to love it. She always said she would not go back east even if you paid her. He was quiet for a moment. The baby did not survive either. A boy. Lillian set down her fork. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly. "Gilbert," he said, "please. After a supper this awkward it seems foolish to be formal." She almost laughed at that. The awkward was in the honesty, she understood, in 2 people who had both lost something sitting across a table from each other and talking about it like adults. There was something almost relieving about it. "Lillian," she said. He nodded. "Lillian," he said, and something about the way he said her name, quietly and with a kind of care, made her feel suddenly and inexplicably like she might cry, which she had not done in front of another person since the week after Robert died. She did not cry. She picked up her fork again and ate another bite of venison stew and said, "The biscuits are extraordinary." And he agreed that Martinez was genuinely the finest cook in Sweetwater County, and they talked about other things, lighter things, the county fair that had been held in August, the the new schoolhouse being built in Rawlins, whether the railroad survey was going to actually result in a line or whether it was going to remain a survey forever. After supper, he showed her to the spare room on the second floor. It was a plain room with a single bed and a wool blanket and a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small window that was entirely opaque with driven snow on the outside of the glass. "There is another blanket in the chest if you need it," he said from the doorway. "The room gets cold once the fire downstairs dies down." "I will be fine," she said. "Thank you, Gilbert." He started to go and then stopped with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. "I am glad you came today," he said. "I mean that separately from the storm. I am glad you came." She looked at him standing there in the lamplight, this quiet, careful man with the gray at his temples and the broken nose and the Emily Dickinson on his bookshelf, and she felt something shift inside her, very slightly, the way a stone shifts when water has been working at it for long enough. "So am I," she said. The storm lasted 2 full days. On the morning of the second day, Lillian came down the stairs to find the kitchen already warm and Martinez making sourdough pancakes at the great iron stove, the smell of them filling the whole lower floor of the house. Gilbert was already at the table with a mug of coffee and a map spread out, marking something on it with a pencil, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and immediately rose. "Good morning," he said. "Sleep all right?" "Very well," she said, which was true and slightly astonishing to her, because she had not slept truly well in months. There was something about the thickness of the walls of the Double H main house, the way it held the storm out with a kind of solid certainty, that had let her rest in a way her own homestead had not been able to manage since Robert died. Martinez set a plate of pancakes in front of her with the solemnity of a man presenting a masterwork, and she thanked him with great sincerity. The 3 of them, because Martinez sat with them for breakfast and supper as a matter of apparent long-standing custom, which she found she liked immediately, talked through the meal. Martinez had been with Gilbert for 12 years, she learned. He had come up from New Mexico territory, following the cattle trails, and found himself at the Double H in what he described as a fit of temporary insanity, and had never left. He spoke of it in a way that made very clear he was not the least bit sorry. After breakfast, since there was nothing to be done about the storm outside, Lillian found herself in the main room by the fire with a book she had taken from the shelf. It was the Dickinson, without consciously choosing it. She had simply taken it because it was the one that had caught her eye the day before, and because she had not read poetry in a long time. Gilbert was at the table with his maps and his account ledgers, working quietly. Occasionally one of his cowboys would knock at the door and come in briefly to report on the stock or the condition of the barn or the height of the drifts, and Gilbert would listen and nod and give clear, unhurried instructions, and the cowboy would go back out into the white roar of the storm. At midday, when Martinez brought coffee to the table, Lillian looked up from the book and said, without planning to, "Did you know she never left her house? Dickinson, toward the end of her life. She stayed in it entirely." Gilbert looked up from his ledger. "I did know that," he said. "Her brother would bring people to visit through the back garden sometimes. She would talk to them through a window." "That sounds terribly lonely," Lillian said. "Maybe," he said. He turned his pencil in his fingers, looking at the fire. "Or maybe she had everything she needed inside the house. The garden, her mind, her poems. Maybe the world outside was the one that felt wrong to her." Lillian considered this. "That is a generous interpretation." "I have wondered sometimes," he said slowly, as if working something out as he spoke, "if the people who seem most alone to us are sometimes just the ones whose inner life is too large for the outside world to contain easily." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and she was glad of it because she was not sure what her face was doing. "That is a remarkable thing to say," she said. He glanced at her, and the faint color that came into his weathered face told her he had surprised himself saying it. "Martinez says I get philosophical when I am stuck inside," he said. "He says it is my most annoying quality." "I find it interesting," she said. simply and honestly. He looked at her for a moment with that careful attention of his, and she held his gaze rather than looking away this time, and something passed between them that was not yet anything named, but was the beginning of something being named. On the afternoon of the second day, the storm broke. The wind died abruptly, the way Wyoming storms sometimes did, as if a door had been shut somewhere out on the plain, and the silence that followed was enormous and clean. The sky beyond the windows went from white to a deep, saturated blue, the particular blue of Wyoming after fresh snow, a color so clear it almost hurt. They went outside together to see the world the storm had made. Snow covered everything to a depth of nearly 2 feet on the flat ground, and the drifts against the north walls were 6 feet high in places. The ranch outbuildings sat in a white landscape that looked entirely remade. Every fence line was picked out in snow. The bare branches of the cottonwood trees along the creek held the snow in perfect arrangements. The ridge of red rock to the northeast was white on its upper faces and still rust-red in its sheer drops, and the contrast of it against the deep blue sky was something that stopped the breath. Lillian stood in the snow outside the porch and looked at it, and felt something open up in her chest, some tightness she had been carrying for so long she had stopped noticing it. "It is beautiful," she said. "Every time," he said, standing a few feet away. "Every storm, it never stops being beautiful afterward." She glanced at him. He was looking at the ridge, his face open in a way she had not seen it yet, the carefulness temporarily set aside. She saw the man underneath the weathered surface of him, and he was someone she found she wanted to know better. It frightened her slightly and interested her enormously. They spent the remainder of the afternoon helping the cowboys clear paths between the outbuildings and check on all the stock. She pitched in without being asked, because she was a rancher's wife, and she knew how to do the work, and it would not have occurred to her to stand aside. She helped break ice off the water trough with the back of an axe, and she helped carry hay from the barn to the small herd of horses in the south corral. And when one of the cows was found in distress and needed to be separated and checked over, she helped hold the animal steady while Gilbert and his cowboy Benny Stills examined her. The cow was fine, rattled by the storm but fundamentally sound. When they came back inside for supper, both of them were pink-cheeked from the cold and there was snow on her coat and his hat, and Martinez looked at the two of them coming through the door together and made a very small expression that she did not quite catch, but that Gilbert apparently did, because he gave Martinez a look that Martinez received with great innocence. The following morning was clear and cold and bright. The road home would be passable. She told Gilbert at breakfast that she would be heading back after the dishes were done. He nodded, he ate his eggs, he put his fork down. "Lillian," he said. She looked up. "I would like to call on you," he said. Directly and without preamble, the way she was coming to understand was simply how he said things. "If that is agreeable to you." She felt her heart do something it had not done in a long time, a quick, warm, slightly terrifying thing. "You want to call on me," she said. "Yes," he said. He met her eyes steadily. "I am aware that you came here to return a rifle and did not come here to be courted. If the idea is unwelcome, say so and I will take you at your word and it will not be awkward between us." She appreciated that, the directness of it, the respect of it. He was not assuming anything. He was asking plainly and offering her a clean exit if she wanted one. "I do not think the idea is unwelcome," she said. She looked at her coffee cup. "I think it might take me a little time to know what I think about it." "I have time," he said. She looked back up at him. "You should know that I am not a simple proposition, Gilbert Hale," she said. "I am a widow with a homestead and a mule named Chester and opinions about things." His expression was warm and steady and entirely unfrightened. "I am well aware of that," he said. "It is part of why I am asking." She felt that shift again, deeper this time, and she let it happen. "All right," she said. "Then I suppose you may call." He rode her home that morning himself, which she had not asked for but did not argue against. They rode side by side through the brilliant snow-covered landscape, their horses' breath making clouds in the cold air, and they talked the whole 8 miles. about the land and its history and the way Wyoming had changed since the cattle drives had really gotten going in the early 70s, and about his plans to expand the herd in the spring, and about her 30 acres and what she had grown there the last 2 summers. At her gate, he helped her down from Pearl in the way that was still proper, but also put his hands at her waist for just a moment, and she was aware of those hands with a vividness that surprised her. "I will come Friday," he said from his horse. "I will be home Friday," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse back toward the northeast. She stood at her gate and watched him go until the sage swallowed him up, and then she went inside and sat down in the kitchen chair and put her hand flat on the table and took a slow breath. Chester knocked at the wall of his shed from outside, his good morning complaint. "I know," she said, to no one in particular. "I know." He came on Friday. He came the following Friday. He came the Friday after that. And then he started coming on Tuesdays as well, and then on an occasional Thursday, and by the time November was fully settled over Wyoming, he was coming to call 3 times a week and staying for supper each time. The county noticed, because in a small county where everyone knew everything, it would have been unusual if they had not. Dorothea Finch, who was Lillian's nearest neighbor and her best source of both practical help and gossip, appeared at Lillian's door on a Tuesday morning with a jar of preserved cherries and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I hear Gilbert Hale has been visiting," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the speed of someone who had been waiting to say this for some time. "He has been calling, yes," Lillian said, pouring coffee. "Calling," Dorothea repeated, savoring the word. "Lillian, the man is the most eligible bachelor in Sweetwater County and possibly several counties adjacent. Women have been trying to get his attention since Margaret died, and he has shown not the slightest interest in any of them, and now he is calling on you." "He is a decent man," Lillian said. "I enjoy his company." "Lillian Thatcher," Dorothea said with tremendous affection. "You enjoy his company. That is what you are giving me." Lillian smiled into her coffee cup. "That is all there is to give right now, Dorothea." "But there is something," Dorothea said, not prying precisely, just not pretending she was blind. "There might be something," Lillian admitted, which was the most she had said out loud to another person about it, and the saying of it made it more real than it had been a moment before. Dorothea reached across the table and covered Lillian's hand with hers. "Robert was a good man," she said quietly, "and you gave him everything. You do not have to stop living because he is gone." Lillian pressed her lips together. She nodded once. "Now," Dorothea said, returning to her natural volume, "tell me everything." The something that was between Gilbert and Lillian grew slowly and steadily through November and into December, the way things grow in cold climates, not with the fast rush of spring, but with a quiet persistence that goes deep. He was, she discovered, a man of considerable depth who wore that depth lightly. He knew the land he lived on with an intimacy that was almost scientific, the migration patterns of the mule deer, the way the water table changed with the seasons, the precise angle of the winter sun over the ridge, and how it affected the south pasture's snowmelt. He had strong opinions about fair wages for his cowboys and about the treatment of the cattle during winter, and she found that he paid Calloway and Benny and his 4 other hands more than any other operation in the county, and fed them well, and housed them in bunkhouses that had proper stoves and windows, because he said that a man could not do good work if he was cold and underfed, and that it was simply good sense as well as being the right thing to do. He was also a man who listened. She had not entirely appreciated how unusual that was until she found herself talking to him, on a Tuesday evening in late November, about something she had not talked about to anyone. She told him about the year before Robert got sick, the year they had planted a full 30 acres and gotten a good harvest, and thought that maybe things were finally going to turn. She told him how they had sat on the porch in the fall evenings and talked about the future, about maybe building a second room onto the house, about maybe getting a second milk cow. She told him that the thing she missed most was not any single specific thing, but the simple fact of having someone to tell things to, the ordinary conversations of a life lived alongside another person. He listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or redirect it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know that particular kind of missing." And the way he said it told her he meant Margaret, and she knew that he did understand it, completely and without explanation needed. In early December, he asked her to come to the Double H for Sunday dinner, which would include Martinez and several of his cowboys, and Calloway's visiting mother who had come from Colorado and was staying in the bunkhouse spare room, and it was understood to be something more social and communal than just the two of them at supper, which had its own warmth. She wore her good dress, the dark green wool one that Robert had always liked on her. She drove herself in the small buggy rather than riding Pearl because the road had patches of ice, and she was carrying a pot of baked beans she had made the night before. The gathering at the Double H was, it turned out, a genuine occasion. Martinez had been cooking since dawn, and the results were staggering. Roasted beef and roasted root vegetables and sourdough bread and 2 kinds of pie. Calloway's mother, a small, energetic woman named Helen who wore her white hair in 2 braids, took an immediate and visible liking to Lillian and spent the better part of an hour telling her everything she knew about Calloway's childhood in Colorado, most of which appeared to embarrass Calloway considerably. The cowboys were respectful and cheerful, the way men are when they are genuinely comfortable in their situation. They treated Gilbert with the ease of people who actually trusted the man they worked for, and Gilbert moved among them without pretension, laughing at Benny Still's long and elaborate story about a lost steer and a very confused sheepherder, leaning on the fence rail with a coffee cup and listening with apparent genuine pleasure. She watched him, that afternoon. She watched him in his own world, among the people who knew him best, and what she saw was a man who was the same in company as he was alone. The same careful attention, the same quiet warmth, the same unhurried quality that she had noticed from the very first day on the porch. He was not performing, he was simply being. She found him beside her at one point in a quiet moment between conversations, the two of them standing by the paddock fence looking out at the afternoon light going orange over the snow-covered ridge. "You are good with your people," she said. He glanced at her. "My people," he said. "Your cowboys," she said. "Martinez, they all seem genuinely content." "A man who treats his employees badly is a fool," he said. "And a man who treats people badly because he is able to get away with it is worse than a fool." "Not everyone feels that way," she said. She thought of some of the other large operators in the county, men who worked their hands hard and paid them little, and considered this the natural order of things. "No," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "There is enough injustice in this territory without a man adding to it deliberately. The Cattlemen's Association squeezing out the small homesteaders. The way the railroad companies have been dealing with the settlers along the survey lines. The way the Shoshone and Arapaho have been pushed further and further off land they have lived on since before anyone's grandfather was born." He said it without heat, just stating facts, but the facts themselves had weight. Man ought to at least keep his own house fair, if he cannot fix the rest of it. She looked at him, at the side of his face in the orange afternoon light. She was aware that she was looking at him with something that was no longer simply interest or appreciation or even the warm gratitude of unexpected companionship. She was looking at him with something considerably more consequential, and she was old enough and honest enough with herself to know what it was. She was falling in love with Gilbert Hale. The knowing of it did not frighten her exactly, but it made her feel solemn. She had loved Robert genuinely and fully, and she had thought when he died that she had used up that particular capacity, spent it entirely and finally. She had not thought she was the kind of woman who would love twice, but the feeling was unmistakable, the way a certain smell is unmistakable even if you have not encountered it in years. You know it because you have known it before. She did not say anything to him that afternoon. She turned back to look at the ridge and let the feeling settle into her. And then Helen Calloway reappeared wanting to show Lillian the quilt she was making for her son, and the moment passed into the ordinary current of the afternoon. But something had been decided. She knew it even if she had not said it aloud. Christmas came. He brought her a gift, left at her door with a note in handwriting that was precise and unexpectedly elegant. It was a book, a natural history of Wyoming's native grasses, which she had mentioned once in passing that she had been wanting because she was trying to understand why one corner of her pasture grew so poorly compared to the rest. The note said only, "I thought this might help with the southeast corner." She sat with the book in her lap and the note in her hand, and thought that a man who listened that carefully deserved to be told what she felt. She told him on a Tuesday, 2 days after the new year of 1879 had come quietly in over the snow-covered plain. He had stayed for supper, as he did on Tuesdays, and afterward they were sitting by the small fire in her main room, the room that was modest compared to his but warm and kept with care. And she had been thinking all through supper about how to say it and had decided finally that there was no elegant way, that direct was better, that he deserved direct. "Gilbert," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, alert and calm. "I am in love with you," she said. "I did not plan it and I was not looking for it, but it is the honest truth and you ought to know it." He was very still for a moment, and then something broke open in his expression, not dramatically, not with great visible emotion, but in the way of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is now allowed to set it down. "Lillian," he said. His voice was lower than usual, roughened with something. "I have been in love with you since the afternoon you walked out of the storm on my porch and told me Chester was an extremely capable mule." She stared at him. Then she laughed, a real laugh, clear and full, and he laughed too. And the sound of it in that small, warm room was the most beautiful thing she had heard in a very long time. When the laughter settled, he reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand in his. His hand was large and warm and calloused, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm. "I would very much like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face, at the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples and the broken nose and the steadiness behind his eyes that she had come to trust entirely. "Yes," she said. "I will have you." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old-fashioned and tender that she felt her eyes sting. They were married on a Saturday in March of 1879, in the small white church in Rawlins, with the Reverend Thomas Briggs officiating, and a congregation that included Dorothea Finch weeping happily in the second pew, all 6 of Gilbert's cowboys in their Sunday boots, Martinez in a remarkable waistcoat he had apparently been saving for exactly this kind of occasion, and Helen Calloway, who had stayed in Wyoming through the winter specifically, she claimed, because the altitude agreed with her joints. And absolutely not because she had decided early on that this wedding was going to happen, and she intended to witness it. Lillian wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored muslin with small blue flowers in the print, the best fabric at the general store, and one that she had looked at twice before she allowed herself to buy it. She wore her dark hair pinned up with small pearl-headed pins that had belonged to her mother. She carried a bunch of dried wildflowers from the Double H mantle, which she had asked Gilbert for because they seemed right, and he had given them to her without question. Gilbert wore a dark suit that fit him well and a white shirt and a bolo tie with a silver clasp, and he stood at the altar of that small church and watched her walk toward him with an expression that made several members of the congregation find something interesting to examine on the ceiling, because it felt almost private, that expression, too unguarded and genuine to be observed directly. When the Reverend Briggs asked if anyone present knew of a reason why these two should not be married, Benny Stills sneezed loudly and caused a moment of collective alarm before it became clear that it was just a sneeze, and then everyone laughed and the ceremony continued. She said her vows. He said his. He did not look away from her once. When Reverend Briggs pronounced them husband and wife and Gilbert took her face in his two calloused hands and kissed her for the first time, properly, and with intention, Dorothea Finch burst into tears of genuine joy, and someone in the back whistled, and Martinez began clapping in the precise rhythm of a man who had been waiting to do exactly that for quite some time. They had a wedding supper at the church hall, which the women of the congregation had organized with the thoroughness that small-town women brought to such undertakings. Tables loaded with food, ham and venison and roasted vegetables and 5 different pies, and a wedding cake that the baker's wife had made as a gift, lopsided on one side but genuinely delicious. She danced with her husband on the plank floor of that church hall with the fiddler playing and the lantern swaying overhead, and when he held her and moved with her through the music, she thought of the morning she had ridden up to his porch with a borrowed rifle on her saddle, and she felt the strangeness and the rightness of it equally. "You know," she said, with her mouth near his ear so she could be heard over the fiddler, "I came to your place to return something borrowed." "And instead you took something away," he said, his arm tightening slightly around her waist. "You make yourself sound very stealable," she said. "You would be surprised," he said, "what a woman with good opinions and a capable mule can manage." She laughed against his shoulder, and he laughed too, and they danced until the fiddler's arm gave out. They went home to the Double H that night. Home, she thought, which was a word she had to get used to applying to a different house than the one she had been living in. Her own homestead would be leased to a family from Ohio that spring, a young couple named the Harpers who had written to the county land office asking about available properties, and the lease money would give them a small but steady supplement to the ranch income. She had packed her things in 4 trunks. She had brought Chester, because it would never have occurred to her to leave Chester, and he settled into the Double H stable with the unimpressed dignity of a mule who considers his own standards non-negotiable. The Double H felt different when it was hers. That was the first thing she noticed. She had thought she might feel like a guest there, the way she had the nights of the storm, looking at another person's arrangement and fitting herself carefully around it. But she did not feel like a guest. She felt as if the house recognized her in some way, as if it had been waiting to be more fully inhabited. She brought her books and added them to his shelf. She brought her mother's blue mixing bowl and set it on the kitchen shelf next to Martinez's equipment, and Martinez received it with appropriate reverence. She moved things slightly, asked his preference about other things, and they negotiated the ordinary details of shared space with a reasonableness and a good humor that made the whole process feel more like cooperation than compromise. Martinez, she discovered very early, was the true authority of the Double H kitchen, and she was happy to operate as his assistant in that domain rather than attempting to displace him. She had her own particular recipes that she brought to the table, including a sourdough apple cake and a venison pie with a crust that Martinez publicly admired, which she felt was the highest possible culinary compliment. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, with great reluctance, and then all at once, the snow going from the lower ground in a matter of days, the sage going green-gray and fragrant in the first warm winds, the creek behind the barn running high and fast in silver with melt. The calving season began, and Lillian worked it alongside Gilbert and the cowboys, because she knew how to work cattle, and she was not going to stand by the fence watching while there was work to be done. Gilbert looked at her the first morning she appeared at the calving barn in her work coat with her sleeves already rolled up and ready, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not expect to be quite so right. "You have done this before," he said. "Robert ran a small herd our first 3 years," she said, "before the fence prices got too high." "Good," he said, "because we lost 2 men to the Remington outfit last month and we are short-handed." She worked the calving season from the first week of March through the second week of April, and she was good at it, patient with the laboring cows and quick to spot trouble and unafraid of the mess of it, which was the most significant qualification. Calloway, who had at first been uncertain how to include her in the work, by the third week was consulting her naturally and without self-consciousness about how to manage a particular cow who was not progressing well. And it was Lillian who finally worked the calf out safely at 2 in the morning, while Calloway held the lantern and Gilbert steadied the mother. When the calf was on its feet, wobbly and enormous-eyed, and the mother had turned to it with that decisive maternal certainty that animals have, Lillian sat back on her heels in the straw and breathed, and Gilbert crouched beside her and put his arm around her and said quietly, "Well done." And she leaned into the solid warmth of him in the cold barn and felt entirely, completely at home. The calving season finished with a count that was the best the Double H had ever had. They celebrated with a supper that Martinez made in the style of his home in New Mexico, complex and smoky and deeply satisfying. And there was music afterward from the accordion that Benny Stills produced from somewhere, and played with more enthusiasm than precision, but with genuine feeling. That summer, Lillian planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the main house in a spot that got good light and had reasonable soil. She planted tomatoes and squash and beans and carrots and several rows of dill and sage. And she built a simple rabbit fence around it that she was proud of, because she had built it without asking anyone to do it for her. Gilbert walked by one afternoon while she was driving the last stake and stopped to watch. "I was going to ask one of the boys to help you with that," he said. "You can tell them I did not need the help," she said, driving the stake home with 3 clean blows of the mallet. "I will tell them nothing of the kind," he said. "It would ruin the example." She laughed, straightening up and pushing the loose hair from her forehead. He was leaning on the fence rail looking at her in the afternoon light, and his expression was the warm, unguarded one that she had come to think of as her particular Gilbert, the one that was just for her. "What?" she said. "I am very glad you came to return that rifle," he said. "I was going to tell you," she said, pointing the handle of the mallet at him, "that I think about that often. The fact that if I had waited until spring the way I almost did, none of this would have happened." "But you did not wait," he said. "I did not wait," she agreed. He came through the garden gate and walked up to her and took the mallet from her hand and set it against the fence post, and then he put his arms around her, right there in the kitchen garden in the afternoon sun, and kissed her with a thoroughness that made her forget what she had been doing. "Gilbert Hale," she said, when she had recovered herself. "Martinez can see us from the kitchen window. Martinez," he said, "has been insufferably pleased with himself since the wedding. Nothing we do surprises him." This was objectively true. Summer deepened, and with it a new reality that came first as a suspicion and then as a certainty. By August she was sure enough to tell him. She told him in the evening on the porch after supper, when the sky was going that tremendous Wyoming orange and the cattle were moving along the far fence line in the golden light, and the windmill was turning slow and the whole world was warm and still. She said, "I think we are going to have a child." He turned to look at her. The orange light was full on his face and she watched what happened to it, watched the thing that moved through him, joy and fear and tenderness all together all at once, and he sat very still with it for a moment. She knew about Margaret. She knew what a baby had cost him before. She waited. He reached over and took her hand, and his hand was not entirely steady. "Are you feeling well?" he asked first, which was the right thing and entirely characteristic. "I am feeling very well," she said. "A little tired." "But well?" He pressed her hand between both of his. His head was bent. She could not see his expression. "Gilbert," she said gently. He looked up. His eyes were bright. "I am so happy," he said roughly, "and I am frightened, both of those things at the same time." "I know," she said. "I am too, both of those things at the same time." He looked at her face, searching it, and she held his gaze steadily and let him see that she was honest about both. "I am going to take very good care of you," he said. "We are going to take care of each other," she said. "That is how this works." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against his side on that porch in the orange evening light. And they sat there together watching the cattle move in the far pasture, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And it was the most complete kind of quiet. He arranged for the county's doctor, a capable and experienced man named Dr. Whitmore who practiced in Rawlins, to come to the ranch monthly rather than just when summoned, which was a practical kindness that she appreciated. Dr. Whitmore was a serious man who wore small spectacles and had delivered what appeared to be approximately half of Sweetwater County, and he examined Lillian with brisk competence and told her that she was healthy and robust, and that he saw nothing to cause concern, and that she should continue her normal activities with reasonable care. She continued her normal activities with reasonable care. She worked the garden. She helped at the ranch in the ways she could. She continued to consult with Calloway on the stock and to make the quarterly accounts with Gilbert at the big table with the ledger books spread out between them, which had become one of her favorite occupations because she was good at numbers and Gilbert was good at the big picture thinking, and together they were better than either one separately. She also told him in September what she had been thinking for several months, which was that the lease arrangement with the Harpers on her former homestead was working well, but that the 30 acres might eventually be worth purchasing additional cattle for, because the grass on the south side of that property was actually quite good, and it was only 8 miles from the Double H main operation, which was manageable. He listened to the whole thing. Then he looked at her with that expression that she loved, the one that was admiration and amusement and warmth all together. "I married a businesswoman," he said. "You married someone with opinions," she reminded him. "Same thing," he said. "And you are right. The south grass on your old place is excellent. I have thought about it. We should write to the Harpers," she said. "See if they want a partner on a small herd or if they would prefer to lease the pasture separately." "We will write to the Harpers," he said, and we had a weight and a pleasure to it that she felt. October came around again, the first October of their marriage, and the anniversary of the day she had ridden up to his porch with a borrowed rifle. She did not mention it on the day itself, but at supper that evening she saw from the slight particular quality of his attention that he had remembered it too. "1 year," she said. "1 year since you arrived to return a rifle," he said. "1 year since you kept me from getting lost in a blizzard," she said. "1 year since Martinez made Johnny cake for a guest and spent the next 3 days being insufferably smug about it," he said. Martinez, who was carrying a pot from the kitchen and had heard his name, said serenely, "I was correct in my assessment from the beginning. Some of us are simply right." They both laughed, and Martinez set the pot on the table with dignity. The baby arrived in February of 1880, and he arrived fast and with great determination, which Dr. Whitmore said was a good sign regarding the child's character. He was a boy. Gilbert was there for every moment of it, which was not customary, and which Dr. Whitmore raised an eyebrow about before determining that Lillian clearly wanted him there, and that a man who stayed calm and was actually useful rather than merely present was not an obstacle to the process. Gilbert held her hand and he talked to her in a low voice throughout, not telling her it would be all right in the vague way that was not quite honest, but telling her specific true things, that she was the strongest person he had ever known, that he was right there, that they were doing this together. When the baby arrived, when the room was filled with that first tremendous cry, Lillian saw Gilbert's face in the lamplight, and she saw something happen there that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He looked at that baby, red-faced and furious and impossibly new, and his face did something that was entirely beyond words. Dr. Whitmore handed the baby to Lillian and she held him against her chest and looked at his furious, scrunched face and said, "Hello." The baby seemed to consider this greeting with deep skepticism, then gradually relaxed into her warmth. Gilbert put his forehead down against hers, very gently, and she could feel that he was trembling slightly. "We have a son," she said. "We have a son," he said. His voice was barely a voice. They named him Samuel Robert Hale, the Robert for her first husband, which was her choosing, and when she told Gilbert that was what she wanted, he took a moment and then nodded. "Robert was a good man," he said. "Samuel Robert is a good name." She loved him for that, for the uncomplicated generosity of it. Samuel was a large, serious-faced baby who regarded the world from his earliest days with an expression of measured consideration that his father recognized immediately, and that Martinez declared to be unmistakably the Hale look. "He is judging us already," Calloway said, holding Samuel with the careful reverence of someone who has not held many babies and is aware of the responsibility. "Look at that expression." "He is thinking," Lillian said. "He does that instead of fussing." "Good instinct," Calloway said to the baby. "Fussing rarely helps." The spring of 1880 was a busy one. Samuel grew. The cattle operation expanded, adding a partnership with the Harpers on Lillian's former property that worked exactly as she had envisioned. Gilbert hired 2 additional cowboys, both Mexican men from the same region as Martinez, whom Martinez appeared to have recruited through some private network, and both of whom were excellent workers and good additions to the Double H community. The ranch had also taken on a new dimension with Lillian's involvement in the accounts and the planning, a dimension that Gilbert spoke about openly, and without any of the awkwardness that some men might have felt about acknowledging that their wife's contributions were significant and strategically important. He said so at the County Cattlemen's Association meeting in April, when the association president, a man named Aldrich who was old-fashioned in his opinions about women and ranching, made a comment that implied the Double H expansion was entirely Gilbert's doing. Gilbert said, pleasantly and without raised voice, that the expansion into the South pastures had been his wife's idea and her business analysis that made the case for it, and that anyone who had not yet had the good sense to get their wife involved in the planning side of their operation was leaving a considerable amount of intelligence on the table. Aldrich was speechless. Calloway, who had accompanied Gilbert to the meeting, reported this exchange to Lillian in full and with tremendous satisfaction upon returning. She was, by the summer of 1880, as fully at home in the Double H as she had been in the homestead she had lived in for 7 years, but in a different way. The homestead had been her life within the limits of what one woman and one man could make of 30 acres in Wyoming. The Double H was something larger, a community, a living organization of people and land and animals and purpose that she was part of in an organic and meaningful way. She knew all the cowboys by name and history. She knew Martinez's sister in New Mexico and her particular method of drying chilies, which Martinez had taught her. She knew which cows were temperamental and which were manageable, and she could tell, just by looking at a pasture, whether the grass was holding up or getting overgrazed. She knew the ridge that ran northeast of the house in every season and every light, and she had climbed it twice, once in spring when the wildflowers were coming and once in the early autumn when the aspens along its base went gold. And both times Gilbert had come with her and they had sat on the warm red rock at the top and looked out over the whole sweep of the Sweetwater Valley, and she had felt, both times, that she was looking at something that was hers in the fullest possible sense. Not by legal title but by love. Samuel took his first steps on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 1880, crossing the braided rug in the main room from the armchair to the low wooden chest, 9 deliberate and triumphant steps, and he stood at the chest with an expression of such profound self-satisfaction that Gilbert, who had been working at the table and looked up at exactly the right moment, laughed out loud and came across the room and scooped his son up and held him at arm's length. 9 steps, he said. A natural. Samuel regarded his father with the measured consideration that was his habitual expression, and then decided, apparently, that this was an acceptable reaction and permitted himself to be hugged. Lillian stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her hands damp from the washing up and her heart so full she thought it might not be able to contain all of it. That same autumn, she realized she was pregnant again, which she announced to Gilbert with less drama than the first time because they both knew by now what they were doing and that they could do it. He smiled, that full genuine smile that she still found beautiful every time. "Samuel needs a sibling," he said. "Samuel needs someone to tell his opinions to," she said. He is his father's son in that regard. I am not opinionated, Gilbert said. She looked at him with the patient affection of a woman who knows exactly who she is married to. You have strong convictions that you express with great deliberateness, she said, which is the same thing, stated more kindly. He considered this. That is fair, he said. The second baby was born in June of 1881, a hot and fragrant Wyoming June with the sage in bloom and the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, and the second baby was a girl. She was smaller than Samuel had been, quick and bright-eyed from her first hours, looking around the room with an expression of intense interest, rather than the considered judgment her brother had started with. Gilbert held her and she looked at his face with those dark, bright eyes and grabbed his finger with her small hand and held on with a grip that surprised him. She is fierce, he said. She is, Lillian agreed from the pillow. They named her Clara Margaret Hale, the Margaret for Gilbert's first wife, which was Lillian's suggestion, and when she made it, Gilbert was silent for a long moment and then said quietly, "That is very generous of you." "It is honest," Lillian said. "She was part of your life. She is part of who you are. Our daughter can honor that." He kissed her forehead. He said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. She understood. Clara Margaret Hale was, from her earliest days, a person who was going to do exactly what she intended and was interested in hearing everyone's opinions first, which she would then evaluate and largely disregard. Martinez adored her. Calloway was slightly afraid of her, which everyone agreed was reasonable. She followed Samuel around the yard of the Double H from the time she could walk, determined to do whatever he was doing, and Samuel, to his credit, accepted her company with an equanimity that his mother recognized as his father's particular brand of patient generosity. The Double H continued to grow, steadily and soundly, through the early 1880s. The partnership with the Harper family on the South Pastures proved successful for all parties. Gilbert added an additional pasture lease along the ridge that gave them summer grazing that stayed green long into the dry months. Lillian's kitchen garden had expanded by 1882 into a substantial vegetable operation that supplied the whole ranch community through the growing season and produced enough surplus that they traded some of it with the town. The bookshelf in the main room grew too. Gilbert ordered books regularly through the Rollins General Store, which had a catalog arrangement with a Denver bookseller, and Lillian added to the collection from the same source. By 1882, the shelf had expanded to 2 full shelves and started on a third, and there was a standing argument of the most affectionate possible variety about which books were given the most prominent placement. The Dickinson remained where it had always been, between the Wyoming Territory Atlas and the Cattle Management Volume, which Lillian pointed out was an interesting editorial statement. Gilbert said that good poetry between practical texts was the natural order of things. On the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, in March of 1882, Gilbert came in from the early morning work and found Lillian in the kitchen, helping Martinez with the breakfast and talking to him about the seed order for the spring garden. The morning light was coming through the east windows, and it caught in her dark hair, which had some gray in it now, threads of silver that she had started to acquire after Samuel was born, and that he thought made her more beautiful rather than less. Samuel was sitting at the table eating his porridge with the methodical dedication he brought to all tasks. Clara was in the corner playing with the collection of spools that she had appropriated from Lillian's sewing basket and arranged into some private architectural system. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Martinez looked up and saw him standing there and said nothing, just gave him the small nod of a man who understands the value of not interrupting a moment. Lillian looked up from the counter and saw him and saw his expression, and she set down the jar she was holding and came toward him. "What?" she said softly. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to look for a moment." She came to him and put her hand against his jaw, tilting his face down toward hers, studying him with the complete attention she had always given him. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am more than all right," he said. I am standing in my kitchen looking at everything I love in one room. I wanted to know what that felt like." She looked at him, this man she had married, and she thought again of the morning she had ridden up to his porch with a borrowed rifle on her saddle, and no intention of staying and no notion of anything except returning a thing that did not belong to her. She thought of the storm that came in and kept her there. She thought of the Johnny cake and the coffee and the Dickinson on the shelf, and the 2 days of being snowbound with a man she barely knew, who turned out to be the most interesting person she had encountered in years. She thought of the ride home through the brilliant snow, and the Tuesdays, and the Sunday dinners, and the December evening by her small fire when she had told him plainly what she felt, and he had told her he had been waiting to hear it since she mentioned Chester. She thought of Samuel's first steps on the braided rug and Clara's grip on Gilbert's finger, and the kitchen garden and the calving season, and the long evenings on the porch in the orange Wyoming light, and the way he still, after 3 years, looked at her sometimes with that particular attention that made her feel like something worth looking at. "I know what that feels like," she said. He put his arms around her in the kitchen doorway, and she put her face against his neck, and behind them Martinez made an elaborate production of being very busy with the bread dough, and Samuel looked up from his porridge and observed his parents with his customary measured consideration, and Clara added another spool to her architectural creation without looking up. "Papa is hugging Mama again," Samuel reported, to no one in particular. "Yes," Martinez agreed, not turning from the bread. "He does that." "Is it important?" Samuel asked. "Extremely," Martinez said. Samuel appeared to accept this and returned to his porridge. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, each one full and distinct, and carrying its own particular character. By 1884, the Double H had grown to one of the most soundly managed operations in the county, not the largest. Gilbert had never been interested in size for its own sake, but one of the most productive and the one with the best reputation for honest dealing. The cowboys stayed because the conditions were good and the pay was fair and the work was meaningful, and there was a stability to the outfit that showed in the quality of everything it produced. Calloway had married the previous year, a quiet woman from Rawlins named Frances who had come out to the ranch, and immediately formed an alliance with Lillian based on a shared opinion about the superior flavor of sourdough starter that was at least 5 years old, and who proved to be an invaluable addition to the community. Calloway had built a small house on the ranch property, with Gilbert's encouragement and help, and he and Frances were expecting their first child by the spring of 1884. Martinez, who showed no signs of going anywhere and had said with complete finality that he intended to die at the Double H and be buried under the cottonwood trees by the creek because the shade was good, had taken on 2 kitchen apprentices who were learning his methods with a seriousness that pleased him. He was teaching them both English and cooking simultaneously, and the lessons frequently bled into each other in ways that were confusing but ultimately effective. Dorothea Finch had married a farmer from the north of the county in 1882, a quiet widower named Elias who grew some good wheat, and possessed the particular solid quality that Dorothea had always deserved. And she and Lillian still had coffee together once a month, and Dorothea was still, reliably, the best source of county news and the most genuinely warm person Lillian had ever known. The Harpers had bought 2 more acres adjacent to Lillian's old homestead and were building themselves into a solid small operation, and their partnership with the Double H on the South Pastures had been formalized into a proper written agreement that benefited all parties and that Lillian was privately proud of having constructed. Samuel, at 4, was a deliberate, curious boy who had decided that he wanted to understand how everything worked, which meant that Gilbert spent a significant amount of time explaining the mechanics of windmills, the engineering of fence posts, the biology of cattle reproduction, and the hydrology of the Double H Creek system to a small person who listened with complete attention and then asked the next logical question. Clara, at 3, had announced with great authority that she intended to learn everything Samuel learned, and also several things he did not learn. And this ambition she pursued with the relentlessness that had characterized her from her first days. She had already, as of April 1884, learned to read from a primer that Lillian had started her on, and was working through it with a speed that delighted and slightly startled everyone. In the spring of 1884, on an April evening with the snow finally gone from the low ground and the creek running high and the first green coming up in the sage, and the meadowlarks working the fence posts in the long late light, Lillian and Gilbert sat on the front porch of the Double H in the two chairs they had put there for exactly this purpose, with coffee, watching the evening come down over the ridge. Samuel and Clara were inside with Martinez, receiving what Martinez called the important education, which in this case involved learning how to make sourdough starter from scratch and the precise difference between wheat flour and corn flour, both pieces of knowledge he considered non-negotiable. The windmill turned slow overhead. The cattle were settled in the pasture. The last orange was going out of the sky over the western horizon, and the first stars were beginning to show above the ridge. "I have been thinking," Lillian said. "Tell me," he said. He had his coffee in both hands, his long legs stretched out, his face turned toward the darkening sky. "I have been thinking that we are very fortunate," she said. "Not in the accidental way, not just fortunate the way the weather sometimes happens to be good. Fortunate in the way that happens when things that could have gone differently went right." He turned to look at her. The last light was on her face, the silver threads in her dark hair and the fine lines around her eyes that were hers alone, the particular way she held herself, with that straight-backed self-possession that he had noticed the very first day. "You almost did not come that October," he said. "I almost waited until spring," she said. "I had almost talked myself into it 3 separate times. What made you go?" She considered it. "Honesty," she said finally. "It was not right to keep what was not mine for another whole season, and I suppose something else, something I could not have named at the time, some pull toward doing the thing rather than putting it off. Fortune favors the honest," he said, "and the punctual," she said. He smiled. "I was afraid when you rode in," he said. "I recognized you and I thought you had come about the rifle and I thought you would leave in 10 minutes. I thought about 10 minutes being all I would get and how to make those 10 minutes matter." She looked at him. "You were afraid." "I was not afraid of you," he said. "I was afraid of watching you leave again. I had watched you at the 4th of July celebration that summer and at the church services when I happened to attend at the same time, and I had never been able to speak with you properly, and your husband had been a decent man who seemed to make you happy, and so I had filed it away as simply one of those things and tried to be satisfied with that." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the scope of this. "Gilbert Hale," she said. "Yes," he said, without embarrassment. "You felt all of that and you asked me if I wanted coffee," she said. "I was working with what the situation offered," he said. She set her coffee cup down on the arm of the chair and reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, the way he always did, and she felt the warmth of it the way she had felt it every time since the first time, always with that same particular awareness. "I am glad you asked about the coffee," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." The evening deepened around them, the stars coming out one by one over the ridge until the whole sky was full of them. That extravagant Wyoming sky that was one of the things she had loved about this country since the first time she had seen it. The sky that went all the way to the edges of everything and was full of more light than you could look at once. Inside the house, she could hear Martinez's voice, patient and rhythmically instructive, and the higher voices of Samuel and Clara asking questions, and a clatter that might have been a bowl and was probably fine. The windmill turned. The creek ran behind the barn. Somewhere on the ridge, an owl called once and then was quiet. She sat beside her husband on the porch of the home they had built together, their hands joined in the dark, and she thought that this was what a life looked like when you did not put off the honest thing, when you picked up a borrowed rifle on an October morning and rode 8 miles into uncertain weather and kept a promise that most people would have forgiven you for breaking. She thought that the world was full of moments like that, small decisions made at ordinary crossroads that turned out to be the ones that mattered most, the ones that led, through coffee and johnny cake and a blizzard and a man's careful eyes and a borrowed book of poetry and 2 children learning to make sourdough in the kitchen, to something so complete and right that it was almost difficult to believe it had started with something as simple as returning what was borrowed. Almost, but not quite. Because Lillian Thatcher, who was now Lillian Hale and intended to remain so for the rest of her considerable and useful and thoroughly lived life, had always known that the most important things usually started simply. She had come to return a rifle. She had found everything. Gilbert tightened his hand around hers, as if he had heard her thinking, as if after all this time the thought between them needed no translation. She tightened hers back. Above the ridge, the stars burned bright and numberless in the black Wyoming sky, and the double H lay quiet and whole in the dark below them. And inside the house, Martinez was teaching the next generation everything he knew. And on the porch in the dark, 2 people who had each lost something irreplaceable sat together and held what they had found, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.